The Afghan sun was a merciless brass hammer, beating down on the dusty expanse of the forward operating base. Heat shimmered in waves from the packed earth, making the distant, razor-edged mountains waver like a mirage. Private First Class. Jason Miller, barely 19 and on his first deployment, felt a trickle of sweat trace a path through the grime on his temple. His hands, slick and clumsy, fumbled with the firing mechanism of his M4 carbine. The pieces refused to align, his frustration mounting with each passing second in the oppressive heat. "Come on, you piece of—" he muttered, the words a low growl in his throat. His buddy, Private Davis, shifted his weight beside him, offering a sympathetic but helpless shrug. A figure moved past their makeshift cleaning station, a study in quiet efficiency. It was the base mechanic, Sergeant Rostova. Her uniform, like everyone else's, was stained with dust and oil, but it hung on her with a worn familiarity that Miller's crisp new gear lacked. She was inspecting the line of Humvees, her eyes missing nothing: a loose strap, a potential fluid leak, the wear on a tire. As she reached up to check a mirror mount, her sleeve slid back, revealing a landscape of scars that mapped her forearm. The skin was a twisted, shiny patchwork of pink and white, a stark testament to some past, violent trauma. Miller watched her, his own frustration seeking an outlet. He nudged Davis with his elbow, nodding subtly in her direction. "Bet she got those reaching into a hot engine block," he whispered, a derisive smirk playing on his lips. "Or maybe a grease fire in the mess tent. What's a glorified mechanic even doing out here anyway? Shouldn't she be back at a real base?" Davis gave a non-committal grunt, but Miller felt a cheap thrill of superiority. It was easier to mock her quiet, weathered presence than to confront his own gnawing incompetence and the ever-present fear that coiled in his gut. He was loud where she was silent, brash where she was reserved. He saw the scars as a weakness, a flaw. He couldn't conceive that they might be the physical ledger of a debt paid in full, a story written in pain and survival. Sergeant Eva Rostova heard the young private's comment as clearly as if he'd shouted it. The words were nothing new. She had heard variations of them for years. She didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even turn her head. Instead, her hand completed its check of the mirror, her fingers, calloused and sure, tightening the bolt a quarter turn. Her gaze, however, lifted from the vehicle and swept past the two recruits, out beyond the concertina wire and the guard towers, toward the barren, unforgiving mountains that cradled the base. Those mountains held her history. The scars on her arms were just the footnotes. A sudden commotion broke the afternoon's lethargy. The sergeant major, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the surrounding hills, strode into the motor pool, his voice cutting through the haze like a crack of thunder. "Listen up! Convoy briefing in 5. We have a high-priority supply run to FOB Viper. Intel suggests the pass is hot. Stay sharp!" The air instantly changed, the lazy heat replaced by a crackling tension. Soldiers began scrambling, checking gear, performing last-minute weapons checks with a new, frantic urgency. Miller finally slammed his rifle back together, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. His first real mission outside the wire. The fear was now a living thing, cold and squirming in his chest. He saw Sergeant Rostova not with a wrench, but standing near the lead Humvee, pulling on a heavy plate carrier over her uniform. She was kidding up. In full combat gear, she looked different, more formidable. The scars on her arms now seeming like strange armor. The sergeant major's eyes scanned the assembling soldiers, his gaze landing squarely on Rostova. The order he gave next froze every young private in their tracks, Miller most of all. "Rostova!" the sergeant major barked. "You're on overwatch. Take the high ground on the eastern ridge. The rest of you get this convoy rolling. We move in 2. A stunned silence fell over the group. They were sending the mechanic? As their lone sniper cover? Their guardian angel in a potential ambush? Miller's eyes widened, his earlier bravado evaporating, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Their lives, his life, were now entrusted to the very woman whose scars he had just mocked. The weight of his own foolishness settled on him, heavier than the body armor he wore. The convoy's engines roared to life, a jarring symphony of diesel and anxiety that ripped through the tense silence. Jason Miller fumbled with his helmet strap, his fingers numb and clumsy. He could not tear his eyes away from Sergeant Rostova. She was not boarding one of the trucks. Instead, she was being handed a long, hard-sided case by the armorer, her movements economical and practiced. She snapped it open, and inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay the components of a M2-10 enhanced sniper rifle. It was not a mechanic's tool. It was an instrument of precise, distant violence, as she assembled the weapon with a quiet, rhythmic clicking of parts sliding home. Miller's mind tumbled back to that morning just a few hours ago, when the world had made a different, simpler kind of sense. He had been heading to the mess tent, the dust already hot under his boots, when he saw her. She was alone, sitting on an overturned crate near the repair bay, a rare moment of stillness. Her head was bowed, and her hands were slowly, almost absently, tracing the patterns of the scars on her forearms. The twisted, shiny flesh looked like a river delta mapped onto her skin. In the clear morning light, the damage seemed even more severe, a story of profound pain he had been too arrogant to read. A cheap, nervous impulse had taken over. He'd wanted to sound tough in front of Davis, to prove he wasn't intimidated by this place or its people. "Let me guess," he'd said, his voice dripping with a mockery he now wished he could swallow back whole. "You tangled with a transmission? Lost a fight with a rotor blade?" He'd even managed a weak laugh, elbowing his friend. Davis had just shuffled uncomfortably, but Miller had pressed on. "What's a base mechanic even doing out here in the sandbox anyway?" She had not looked up. She had not granted him the satisfaction of a reaction. Her fingers had stilled for just a second, then continued their slow journey over the ruined skin. Her gaze remained fixed on some distant point, far beyond the wire fences and the guard towers. She was looking at the mountains. The same mountains they were now heading straight toward. At the time, he had mistaken her silence for shame, for weakness. Now, watching her shoulder the rifle and accept a pouch of loaded magazines, he understood it had been a profound and utter dismissal. He was beneath her notice, an insignificant noise. The memory was a cold stone in his gut. The convoy began to lurch forward, the heavy gates of the FOB swinging open to reveal the treacherous, dusty road beyond. Miller gripped his rifle tighter, the plastic stock feeling alien in his hands. He looked at the other soldiers in the truck with him. Their faces were set in grim masks, jaws tight, eyes scanning the high ground. They were all placing their trust, their very last breath, in the hands of the woman he had insulted. Every joke, every sneering comment now felt like a betrayal of the entire unit. The scarred mechanic was their sniper. And he, Private Jason Miller, was just a loud, frightened boy riding into a valley he suddenly knew she understood far better than he ever would. The world dissolved into a deafening roar. The first RPG strike hit the lead Humvee, not with a bang, but with a concussive whoomp that sucked the air from Miller's lungs. Shrapnel screamed through the air, pinging against the armored sides of their truck. "Contact front! Contact front!" Someone was screaming, the voice raw with panic. Miller's training evaporated. He froze, his body pressed hard against the hot metal floor, the acrid smell of cordite and burning fuel filling his nostrils. This was it. This was the chaotic, violent end he had secretly feared since he arrived. Through the choking dust and chaos, a voice cut across the radio. It was not the frantic yelling of the convoy commander. It was calm, flat, and chillingly precise. It was her voice. "Reaper to all stations. Enemy, 12 o'clock, East Ridge. 2 technicals, 4 shooters in the rocks. I have eyes on." A high-powered crack, distinct from the rattle of AK-47s, echoed down from the cliffs above them. It was the sound of her rifle. One of the enemy shooters, who had been raining fire down on them, suddenly crumpled and fell from his perch. A moment later, another crack, and a man manning a machine gun on a technical slumped over his weapon. Miller dared to peek over the side of the truck. He saw the lead Humvee, disabled and smoking, but the enemy fire from the ridge was becoming sporadic, disorganized. They were being hunted. The mechanic, the woman he had mocked for her scars, was not just a shooter. She was a force of nature. She was a specter, a guardian angel they never knew they had, systematically dismantling the ambush from her invisible throne high above. Each shot was a statement, Each crack of the rifle was a lie told to his earlier arrogance. He was pinned, useless, a spectator to his own potential demise. He watched as a medic scrambled from his cover to reach a wounded soldier caught in the open. An insurgent popped up from behind a rock, rifle raised to cut the medic down. Before Miller could even shout a warning, another sharp crack rolled down from the mountain. The insurgent jerked backward and was still. The medic never even broke stride, hauling the wounded man to safety. In that moment, Miller understood the true depth of his ignorance. This was not about mechanics or scars. This was about a bond he was not yet worthy of. This was about a silent promise to protect, a promise she was keeping with terrifying efficiency. The fear in his gut began to curdle into a thick, shameful sludge. He had judged a book by its cover, and the cover had nearly gotten him killed. The real story, the one written in fire and skill on that mountain, was one he was only now beginning to read. The smell was the same. Cordite, dust, and the dry, thin air of the high Afghan passes. As Eva Rostova exhaled, the world narrowed to the circle of her scope. The crosshairs settled on a man scrambling for an RPG launcher. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar and comforting jolt. The crack echoed, a sound that had been the soundtrack to the most defining moments of her life. It was the same sound that had echoed in these very mountains years ago, but back then, it was aimed at her. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow, triggered by the scent of the fight below. She was not Sergeant Rostova, mechanic. She was Captain Rostova, Air Force Combat Rescue Officer, crammed into the side door of a Pavehawk helicopter, the wind whipping at her flight suit. They were coming in low and fast, a desperate extraction under fire. The code name of the downed pilot they were retrieving was frantic on the radio. Then came the world-shattering impact. An RPG had found its mark. The helicopter shuddered violently, a dying metal beast. The scream of tearing metal was deafening, a flash of searing heat. The sensation of falling, tumbling. The world a violent kaleidoscope of sky and rock and fire. That was where the scars began. The fire that had bloomed inside the shattered fuselage. The struggle to unbuckle, to drag her wounded pilot, to crawl from the wreckage that was already being peppered with enemy fire. The pain was a white-hot brand, but the training was deeper. She had fought. She had returned fire. She had called in their own coordinates, knowing another bird would be coming. A reckless, beautiful act of loyalty that would risk more lives to save theirs. The scars on her arms were not from a kitchen fire or a mechanic's accident. They were the autograph of a crash landing, the price of survival paid in burned flesh and shattered bone. They were a permanent reminder of the day she learned what it truly meant to be vulnerable, to be the one needing rescue. She blinked, the memory receding as quickly as it came. Her finger found the trigger again. Another shooter fell. The young private Miller was still pinned down there. She could see his frightened face through her scope. He was just a kid. They were all just kids. After her recovery, after the long and painful surgeries and the medical board that tried to ground her permanently, she had been offered a quiet desk job, a hero's retirement. She had refused. She had fought, pleaded, and used every ounce of her leverage to get back. Not as a pilot, that door was closed, but she could still serve. The mechanic cover was a necessary fiction, a way to stay near the fight, to be close to the sounds and the smells that were her native language. It was a penance, a silent promise to the ghosts of her crew, and a vow to the new green soldiers like Miller. She would be their guardian from the shadows, using the skills forged in her own near death to ensure they made it home. She would protect the next generation, a lone sentry on a mountain, repaying a debt that could never fully be settled. The last shot echoed, its sharp report fading into the stunned silence that settled over the pass. The enemy fire had ceased. Below, the convoy soldiers emerged from their cover, moving with the cautious, dazed movements of men who had just stared into the abyss. The immediate threat was over. The medic worked freely now, and the smoke from the disabled Humvee began to thin, tracing a gray column into the pale blue sky. Eva Rostova remained on the ridge, her body coiled with the residual tension of the fight. She methodically scanned the opposite ridgeline through her scope, her sniper's patience ensuring the silence was not a trick. Her breathing which had been so steady and controlled, now felt shallow. The adrenaline was receding, and in its wake came the ghosts. She saw the young private Miller being helped to his feet by his buddy. His face was a pale mask of shock and relief. He was just a boy. They were all just boys, their lives balanced on the edge of a knife she had just pushed back. This was why she was here. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for this single, fragile moment. The moment a soldier who thought he was going to die realized he got to live. After the crash, after the long and painful reconstruction, the Air Force had offered her a comfortable desk, a teaching post, a quiet retirement as a decorated but broken hero. She had refused them all. The thought of being away from the sound of the war, from the dust and the fear and the profound responsibility for the people next to you, was a fate worse than any enemy fire. She had fought, pleaded, and pulled every string she had left. The mechanic cover was a necessary fiction, a compromise forged with a sympathetic general who understood that some soldiers were simply wired for the front lines. It was a penance. It was a silent promise made to the memory of her co-pilot who hadn't made it out of that burning wreckage. She would stand guard for the next generation. She would use the skills honed in her own near destruction to be a shield. Every time she saw a young, frightened face like Miller's, she saw the face of every young pararescue man, every young pilot she had ever failed to bring home. This was her atonement, her lonely vigil on a dusty ridge, ensuring that as many of these boys and girls as possible got the second chance she had been given. It was a debt that could never be fully repaid, only serviced with each careful breath and each perfectly placed shot. She finally lowered her rifle, the weight of it a familiar and comforting anchor. The immediate fight was over, but her mission, her promise, was eternal. The convoy limped back into the forward operating base, a battered and bruised snake of metal and exhausted men. The air, which hours before had been thick with taunts and bravado, was now heavy with a stunned silence. Soldiers moved with the slow, deliberate motions of the profoundly weary, their eyes hollow. Jason Miller climbed out of the truck, his legs feeling like rubber. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze, least of all his own reflection in a vehicle's dusty window. The shame was a physical weight on his shoulders, heavier than any rucksack. He watched as Sergeant Rostova walked toward the motor pool, her sniper rifle case slung over her shoulder. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she had shown that morning, as if she had just completed a routine maintenance check, not a surgical counter-ambush that had saved all their lives. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, anything, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? The sound of approaching rotor blades cut through his turmoil. A command helicopter, sleek and menacing, settled onto the landing pad in a storm of dust and noise. The side door opened and a man stepped out. He was a two-star general, his uniform crisp even after the flight, his posture radiating an authority that made the young private stand even straighter. Miller's heart sank. This was it. High Command was here to investigate the ambush. They would want a debrief. They would find out that a mechanic, acting outside her official capacity, had taken a sniper rifle and engaged the enemy. He watched, helpless, as the general and the sergeant major spoke in low, urgent tones. The sergeant major pointed toward the motor pool, toward Rostova. Miller's stomach clenched. He was sure she was about to be reprimanded, maybe even court-martialed, and it would be his fault for surviving because of her unsanctioned actions. The general nodded, his face an unreadable mask, and began striding purposefully across the compound. Soldiers froze mid-task, saluting as he passed, but his eyes were locked ahead. He walked directly toward the scarred, oil-stained figure of Sergeant Eva Rostova. Miller held his breath, waiting for the sharp official tone, the demand for an explanation. Instead, the general did something that shattered Jason Miller's understanding of the world. He did not salute. He did not speak a single word. He simply opened his arms and pulled the weary sergeant into a fierce, emotional, and utterly paternal embrace. He held her for a long moment, his head bowed slightly, his hand patting her back as if comforting a daughter he thought was lost. The entire motor pool had gone completely silent. You could hear the distant flutter of the helicopter's cooling blades. The general finally released her, holding her by the shoulders at arm's length. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from a flag officer. It was a mixture of awe, relief, and profound respect. "The rescue community? They whispered you were still out here," he said, his words carrying in the quiet. "They said a ghost was watching over the passes. I never believed it. Not until I saw the after-action report from this sector cross my desk this morning." He shook his head, a slow, wondering gesture. "It's good to hear your voice on the net again, Reaper." The name Reaper hung in the dusty air, not as a word, but as a seismic shock that rearranged the very ground beneath Jason Miller's feet. It was a name spoken in hushed, legendary tones in training camps and barracks, a myth from a previous era of the war. The Reaper was the sniper who had held this very pass for 72 hours against overwhelming odds to cover a medical evacuation. The Reaper was the one who held the record for the longest combat shot that saved a downed pilot's life, a shot most snipers swore was ballistically impossible. The Reaper was a ghost, a story told to wide-eyed recruits to show them the upper limits of courage and skill. And she had been here all along, quietly fixing their trucks, her legendary call sign buried beneath a layer of dust and disdain. The general turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers, their faces a canvas of shock and dawning understanding. He was no longer just embracing an old comrade. He was delivering a eulogy for their collective ignorance. "This," his voice boomed, clear and strong, "is Captain Eva Rostova. Call sign Reaper." He let the rank and the name settle. Captain. She had not been demoted. She had been hiding. 5 years ago, her Pavehawk was shot down in these very mountains. She pulled 2 crewmen from the burning wreckage and fought off an enemy assault force for 6 hours with a sidearm and a rifle she took from the dead, waiting for rescue. The scars you see are not from a mechanic's accident. They are the price of a miracle. They are the marks of a hero who refused to quit. He looked directly at Miller, though he seemed to be looking through him, at every young soldier who had ever underestimated the quiet woman in the motor pool. The record for the longest confirmed combat shot that saved a life belongs to her. You are alive today, every one of you, because a legend chose to walk among you, because she chose to serve in any way she could to keep you safe. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with the deafening roar of Miller's own shame. He had mocked a living, breathing piece of history. He had insulted a level of sacrifice he could not even comprehend. He looked at Captain Rostova. She had not moved. She stood there, enduring the recognition, her face still a mask of quiet humility. She did not want this glory. That much was clear. She had only ever wanted to do her duty, to keep her promise. In that moment, Jason Miller finally understood the vast, unbridgeable chasm that lay between being a soldier and being a warrior. He had been playing dress-up in the uniform of a hero, while the real thing had been standing next to him all along, her valor written in scars he was too blind to read. The weight of the name Reaper was a physical pressure in the air, so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. The general's words had not just revealed a secret. They had rewritten history for every soldier present. The myth was real, and she was standing before them, her gaze fixed on some distant point, enduring the unwanted spotlight. Jason Miller could not look away from her. The scars on her arms were no longer flaws. They were a battle standard, a testament to a will to survive that was beyond his understanding. They were the visible proof of a story of sacrifice he had casually dismissed. The memory of his own voice, loud and mocking, echoed in his mind, a pathetic, tinny sound against the symphony of her service. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck, burning his ears. He had been so certain of the world's order, so sure that his new uniform and his rifle made him someone of importance. He now saw the profound arrogance of that belief. He was a tourist in the land of warriors, and he had mistaken the guide for a servant. The general, after a final, respectful nod to Captain Rostova, turned and walked back toward his helicopter, his mission of recognition complete. The spell of silence broke, replaced by a low-hummed murmur of conversation, but no one approached her. A space had cleared around her, not out of fear or ostracism, but out of a newfound, almost reverent respect. She was no longer just one of them. She was something more. Miller watched as she picked up a grease-stained rag from a workbench and walked toward the Humvee that had taken the brunt of the RPG blast. She began wiping her hands, her movements, as always, practical and efficient. She was not basking in the glory. She was returning to her work, to her duty, to her promise. This, more than anything the general had said, was the final crushing lesson. True heroism was not about recognition or glory. It was about showing up the next day and doing the work, even when no one was watching, even when the only thanks you received were insults from ignorant boys. It was a quiet, relentless dedication to the person next to you. Miller's legs felt weak. He leaned against the side of the truck, the metal still warm from the Afghan sun. He looked at his own hands, soft and unmarked, and then back at her scarred forearms. The distance between them was immeasurable. He had learned more in the last 10 minutes than in all his months of training. He had learned about sacrifice, about humility, and about the profound, silent cost of true courage. He had mocked her scars, and in return she had given him the gift of a perspective he would carry for the rest of his life. He would never look at another soldier the same way again. Every quiet NCO, every weathered face, now held the potential for a hidden history, a story of silent heroism. The recruit who had mocked her was gone, silenced forever. In his place stood a humbled young man who finally understood that the strongest warriors rarely felt the need to make any noise at all.